More than 1,700 men were killed and wounded in just a few minutes. He then tried building a canal through the swamps in an effort to get south of Vicksburg, but this too failed. Finally, he decided upon a series of diversions, the most famous of which was Grierson's raid. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Grierson's raid. Go ahead and put the dates. Okay, and our lesson today is about Grierson's raid. To help divert the attention of the Confederate Army in order to keep them from challenging his crossing the Mississippi River, General Grant created a plan that worked better than anyone could have hoped for. There were three main parts of the plan. Rather than attack Vicksburg from the river, which was suicidal, he would assault the city from the east. Okay, so there's three parts to his plan. Number one, attack from the east. To do this, he needed to capture Jackson, Mississippi, some 50 miles away. Jackson was a major supply line, and taking it would cut Vicksburg off from the rest of the Confederacy. So he had to attack from the east. So first he had to capture Jackson, Mississippi. So he had to capture Jackson, Mississippi. The second part of the plan, okay, here's the second part of the plan, called for General William T. Sherman's division to demonstrate in front of Haynes Bluff, which was north of the city of Vicksburg. His men, along with 3 gunboats, would create enough activity so that the defenders would think this was a full-scale attack. This would make it difficult for any of these rebel troops to be moved south to challenge Grant's landing when his men were ferrying across. It was here that so many men were lost in a short time. Okay, so the second part was for Sherman to attack from the north. So Sherman was to attack from the north of Vicksburg. Okay, so what he's trying to do is he's creating a diversion. And this would make it difficult for any of these rebel troops to be moved south to challenge Grant's landing when his men were ferrying across. The last diversion called for Grant sending Colonel Benjamin Grierson's cavalry unit riding through the length of the state of Mississippi from Tennessee border of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Their job was to create as much chaos as possible, tearing up supply lines and doing it without getting caught. Once they reached Baton Rouge, they would be back in Union territory. If the diversions worked, they would make the fall of Vicksburg much easier to accomplish with fewer men lost in battle. So the third part of the diversion was Colonel Grierson Colonel Grierson was to ride through the length of the state of Mississippi. Okay, so he was to ride from the Tennessee border, from Tennessee border to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and create as much chaos as possible. They're supposed to tear up supply lines and do it without getting caught. So they're tearing up supply lines. And if these diversions worked, they would make the fall of Vicksburg much easier to accomplish with fewer men lost in battle. Okay, so this is the plan. They're trying to capture Vicksburg. Okay, they've tried before and without success. So the Union Army, General Grant, has a plan. It's called Grierson's Raid. It consists of 3 parts. One is to attack from the east. To do that, they have to capture Jackson, Mississippi. The second part of the plan was for Sherman to attack from the north of Vicksburg. The third was for Colonel Grierson to ride from Tennessee border to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, tearing up supply lines. Let's see what happens. Okay, the next is called Unknown Territory. Unknown Territory. Colonel Benjamin Grierson had been a band teacher before the war. His cavalry was set out of LaGrange, Tennessee on April 17, 1863. His task for the next 2 weeks was to disrupt the Confederate lines of communication. He was to destroy as much as he could, and his troops were expected to live off the land in order to be as mobile as possible. For the next 14 days, his men became the focus of virtually all Confederate activity in the state of Mississippi. Remember, because he's supposed to tear up supply lines. Okay. So let's talk about Colonel Grierson. Okay, so he's destroying communication lines, his men are supposed to live off the land, so they don't have to carry anything with them. Colonel Grierson was taking his men into territory where no blue uniformed soldier had been since the war started. No one knew what to expect or what kind of forces they would meet. All Grierson knew was that he had been ordered to attack the supply lines of General John Pemberton and his troops defending Vicksburg. This meant destroying as much of the Southern Railroad as they possibly could. Okay, so he has to destroy the railroad, destroy Southern Railroad. Along with storages of supplies located at various points along the way. Okay, so he's destroying the railroad. And he's supposed to destroy their supplies. Southern supplies. This would be the easy part of the mission. Grierson understood that once this was accomplished, every rebel in the state would be after him and his men. So escaping was going to be most difficult. He was given 3 suggestions of routes to take in trying to depart Mississippi. None would take him to in the direction that he came from. He was to pick one while on his way through the state. Eventually, they would take a route which led them to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a Union stronghold. So he knew that destroying all this would be easy. The most difficult part would be escaping. So the difficult part is escaping. Because remember, he's creating a diversion. He's getting everybody to chase him so they can take over Vicksburg. Okay, the Quinine Brigade. Let's talk about the Quinine Brigade. Quinine Brigade. On the 4th day out, Grierson performed the daily inspection of his men. The results were not promising. 175 of his 1,700 men were deemed unfit for the duty ahead of them due to dysentery, ague, and saddle sores. These soldiers dubbed themselves the Quinine Brigade. They were ordered back to Tennessee and were given 1 piece of artillery. These men were told to ride back in groups of 4 across and make attempts to obliterate their tracks, but if evidence were found, it would produce the impression that all the troops had returned. Okay. So there were 175 men unfit for travel. Is travel the word I want? Well, it's not unfit for travel. It's unfit for, I guess I want to say unfit for fighting. Because basically they were sick. Okay, they were too ill to fight. I'm going to put too ill. You just need to remember that's because they were sick. They had dysentery, ague, and saddle sores. So these 175 men are known as the Quinine Brigade. They were to ride back to Tennessee. So they were sent back to Tennessee. And they thought that if the Confederates saw their tracks, they would think that the whole army decided to turn around and go back. Another regiment was sent out the next day and was given the task of destroying part of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. Okay, let's talk about it. So Colonel Grierson, his job was to destroy communication lines. They had to live off the land so they could travel quicker, destroy Southern Railroad, destroy the Southern supplies. And they knew this was the easy part. They knew that once everybody was after them, it would be difficult for them to escape. Right now we're talking about the Quinine Brigade. There was 175 men unfit for fighting. They were too ill, so they were sent back to Tennessee. They thought that if the Confederates saw their tracks, they would think that the army turned around, so it would send the Confederates in the wrong direction. Okay, well, the next day, another regiment was sent out and was given the task of destroying the Mobile, Ohio Railroad. They accomplished the task and turned back north, again given the impression that all were going back. Both units made it back to Tennessee after fighting a couple of several battles while losing only 10 men. The rest of Grierson's cavalry headed further north. So I'm just going to call it another regiment, or regiment. Okay, now this regiment, this is still Grierson's army, but they were to destroy the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. Destroy Mobile and Ohio Railroad. They accomplished the task. They made it back to Tennessee. And again, they thought if Confederates would think that the Army was leaving or was taking a different direction, that the Army was heading north. Okay, and both of them made it back to Tennessee. So the rest of Grierson's cavalry headed farther south. Okay, so Grierson headed south. Newton Station. Grierson's next objection was a place called Newton Station. So let's talk about Newton Station. This was an important storage depot on the Southern Railroad. He sent a number of scouts into the town, and they were able to capture the telegraph office, thus keeping the town from spreading any alarm or adjoining communities. These scouts were dressed as Confederate uniforms, making their job much easier than it would have been. No one suspected anything until it was too late. When the main body of Union troops arrived before noon, they immediately went to work. They destroyed locomotives, freight cars loaded with supplies for Vicksburg, and a supply building filled with small arms, uniforms, and ammunition. Okay, so Newton Station was an important storage depot. It was an important storage depot. On the Southern Railroad. Okay. On the Southern Railroad. Okay. Okay, he sent scouts to the town. And what these scouts did is they captured the telegraph office. Now today we have phones, we have cell phones, we have the internet. They didn't have any of that. The telegraph office was their only means of communication. Okay, so this hindered them from being able to send any messages for more supplies or for backup. But the other thing about these scouts is they were dressed in Confederate clothes. They were dressed as Confederates. Okay, they're dressed as Confederate soldiers. Okay. So Grierson sent another regiment to destroy the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, and he knew that if the Confederates saw their tracks, he would think that his army was heading north, but Grierson did the opposite. The rest of his army headed south. Their next goal was Newton Station. Newton Station was an important storage depot on the Southern Railroad. He sent scouts to town. They captured the telegraph office, and they were dressed as Confederate soldiers. So the people didn't expect anything. They didn't realize what was going on until it was too late. Okay, so when the main body of Union troops arrived before noon, they immediately went to work. Okay, so the Union Army, when they arrived, they destroyed locomotives, freight cars loaded with supplies for Vicksburg, and a supply building filled with small arms, uniforms, and ammunition. So they took all the supplies. Okay? So when the rest of the army showed up, they took whatever supplies they could find. Okay? They destroyed locomotives. I better put this here. They destroyed locomotives, I guess they didn't take the supplies. They destroyed the locomotives. They destroyed freight cars filled with supplies. And a supply building. Okay, and they destroyed a supply building. They ride west. Okay, so let's talk about what happens when they ride west. This took about 2 hours. At 2 p.m., the raiders began their ride south, and they did not stop again until midnight. They spent the next day lying low and eating large amounts of smoked ham taken from Newton Station. The goal was now to move west, hoping to get to the Mississippi River and link up with Grant. Okay. So they're now they're heading west, and they're trying to hook up with General Ulysses S. Grant. They crossed the Pearl River and destroyed a railroad at Hazelhurst. It was here that by accident they set fire to the town. It was just an accident. Okay. At Hazelhurst, they destroyed a railroad. And they accidentally set fire to the town. The federal troops worked with citizens to keep the whole town from burning down. Okay. So they worked to put the fire out. Later, at a place called Union Church, they were attacked from the west by Confederate troops. They were able to repulse them, but were forced to change directions and move south. It was at this point that they decided to try to go to Baton Rouge. Okay? So the next place they come to is Union Church. So at Union Church, they were attacked from the west by Confederate troops. Attacked from west by Confederates. Okay, so they had to change directions. So they decided to try to go to Baton Rouge. Let's put on to Baton Rouge. Okay, so we said when they got to Hazelhurst, they destroyed a railroad and they accidentally sent fire to the town, so they worked with the citizens to put out the fire. When they got to Union Church, they were attacked from the west by the Confederates, so they were forced to change directions, so they decided to head south. And so now they're going to Baton Rouge. Upon reaching Summit, Mississippi, they did more damage to the railroad. So in Summit, Mississippi, they damaged the railroad. But they decided not to burn the supply depot for fear of setting that town on fire. Over the next 28 hours, they covered 75 miles, barely keeping ahead of their pursuers. Rebel troops were finally able to catch up with them at Walls Bridge on Tickfall River. Okay. So Walls Bridge on the Tickfall River. Grierson put his artillery to use, though shelling the enemy troops on the opposite bank and leading a charge across the bridge, forcing them to flee. Once this was accomplished, they rode through the night. Okay, so he shelled the enemy troops. So he bombed them is what he did. Shelled enemy troops. And he led a charge across the bridge. And they fled. So they rode through the night. When they were 6 miles short of Baton Rouge, Grierson called a halt to the riding. Most of his 1,000-man column were reeling from their saddles from fatigue and hunger. Many of his men were simply tumbled out of their saddles and slept where they fell. After they awoke, they paraded into Baton Rouge, where they were met by cheering crowds of soldiers and civilians. These men had covered 600 miles in 16 days. They had suffered only a few dozen casualties, including those who had to be left behind because of wounds or illness. At the same time, they had captured and paroled 500 prisoners, destroying between 50 and 60 miles of railroad track, and captured 1,000 horses and mules. Most important, they had occupied much of the Confederate Army, keeping the focus away from General Grant so he could ship men across the Mississippi River, and move his army toward Jackson, Mississippi, virtually unopposed. So the outcome, or maybe I should put accomplishments. Okay, accomplishments. They had traveled 600 miles in 16 days. They captured and paroled 500 prisoners. They destroyed 50 to 60 miles of railroad track. They captured 1,000 horses and mules. But most important, they occupied much of the Confederate Army, keeping the focus away from General Grant so he could ship men across the Mississippi River and move army towards Jackson, Mississippi, virtually unopposed. So he created the diversion so Grant could cross the river. Okay. He created a diversion so Grant could cross the Mississippi River. Okay, so let's review. Before completing the problem set, make sure you understand the main points of this lesson. General Grant had a threefold plan for defeating Vicksburg. Have Sherman fake an attack from the north, capture Jackson, Mississippi to the east and cut off the Confederate supply line, have Colonel Grierson's cavalry wreak havoc in the state of Mississippi. Colonel Grierson's cavalry rode 600 miles in just 16 days. Along the way, they destroyed trains and freight in Newton Station, accidentally set the town of Hazelhurst on fire and then helped townspeople save it, fought Confederate troops at Union Church, severely damaged the train depot at Summon, Mississippi, arrived in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a Union stronghold. They successfully diverted Confederate attention away from Grant, who thus was able to land his army east of the Mississippi River unopposed. I want you to study this lesson, study your notes, and answer the questions. You need to continue memorizing the Gettysburg Address.